Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
An analysis from USAFacts finds that many of the government's most important public data sets are no longer being updated or maintained as expected. The findings underscore how staffing, continuity, and organizational attention shape whether federal data remains usable at all. Here to break down what's changing and why is Richard Coffin, Chief of Research and Advocacy at USAFacts. Richard, it's great to have you on the show. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Terry. It's great to be here.
USAFacts is covering a lot of ground that the government used to. So first of all, tell us what you do, and then talk to us about this latest assessment that you've shared.
We at USAFacts have been spending about the last 11 years trying to make government data accessible to the public. We realized years ago it's actually really complicated to use for the public, even though it's paid for by taxpayers and so much money is invested in it. So we've spent the last decade or so actually taking data from government agencies that's already publicly available and trying to visualize it, help people understand it, make it more usable digitally on our website, usafacts.org.
In this latest assessment, you looked at public data tools that were once considered best in class, government data sets that were widely used, regularly updated, and trusted. When you've looked across that landscape, what are you seeing now?
Yeah, it's a great question. About, when we started, we realized actually pretty quickly that we believe government data itself is absolutely the best in class, but the tools themselves are sort of all over the place, right? They've always been pretty inconsistent. Some are amazing, some are pretty awful and hard to use. But this last year has really led to some questions about what's happened to them, especially as we've had stories about things going offline and we've heard one-off anecdotes. And we thought what we really needed was a level of quantitative understanding of what actually happened with government data at the federal level. And we had started a year ago something called the Federal Data Excellence Program, which was our intent of being able to share what are the best federal data products and raise them up and give an award to them as a way for other federal agencies to understand what really the North Star could be. And a year later, we said, let's look at the ones that we looked at the first year and see what actually happened to them. And so we had looked at about 55 products. 2 of them had been taken offline. And of the remainder that were meant to be updated, the big thing we found was about 40% of them hadn't been updated or had missed an update in the year. And so that's really the big thing that we saw is that 50% were fine, 40% or so had missed some sort of update, 10% about had some level of reduced functionality, meaning something was missing. And this was what we believe is one of the few quantitative studies of what actually happened in the last year with federal data.
When you connect those dots from going offline to not being updated to not working at all, is there a pattern that emerges from all of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big pattern that we've really been seeing is that the cumulative effect of everything that's been going on with government is that there are just fewer updates to data that has been updated pretty frequently in the past. We saw this several times this year with things like, we missed an inflation update in the middle of the year. We saw things like immigration data become slower to update. Data that really is in the public eye quite frequently just hasn't been as updated as much as we used to see.
What do you think is driving the missing data? Is it staffing levels? Is it software challenges? Is it, I don't know, the data just not being available?
Well, the bottom line is we actually don't know, right? There's so much, there are so many potential reasons, and they're not terribly transparent. And so we really don't know what's actually driving them. Of course, we have seen things like government shutdowns this year that certainly created funding lapses. We've seen changes to the structure of federal employment and how many people were employed by the government. So all of these things are potential things that have changed the frequency of updates to data.
And what happens when that data is missing?
It hurts me as someone who spends a lot of my time dealing with it. But more broadly for the American public, it really does erode trust. I mean, we look at this stuff as if it were infrastructure, right? It should be pretty constant. And when it goes away, people have less understanding of what government's doing, what the country looks like, what their members of Congress are doing, and what their elected officials are doing. And so we believe that when that goes away, people really stop being able to understand the full picture of the country. And when they can't understand it, it leads to mistrust. And so it's not what we hope to see happen.
I'm speaking with Richard Coffin. He's Chief of Research and Advocacy at USAFacts. Richard, you mentioned the 43-day shutdown from last year. It shows up repeatedly in your findings. As you look back now, What did that period reveal about which data functions were resilient and which ones proved maybe especially vulnerable to disruption?
It's interesting. With the general delays and amount of time it takes to create federal data, we're actually still seeing the impacts of the shutdown and some of these issues. I would say the stuff that we immediately saw, the data we immediately saw have challenges were the data that comes out frequently, right? We missed an update, for example, on inflation that was really important around the fall when people were wondering really what was happening with prices, and it actually it led to some of the BLS data that wasn't out. There were just a bunch of things that we regularly see frequently not come out. And so that's the stuff that's immediately impacted. But, longer term, we saw things like data sets like the tax data that we look at, individual income tax data that normally is released earlier in the year. It wasn't released until about 2 weeks ago. And so we have a report that comes out every tax day. We actually weren't able to publish it for the first time in our history because of that delay. And so we're still seeing the lagging effects of the shutdown and other things like that.
We like to talk about fact-informed, evidence-based program management in government. We want the people who are in charge of the programs to have the right data to make decisions about, should this program serve more people, less people? Is it serving the right people? And so when you're talking about this missing data or delayed data, from an institutional standpoint, what happens when the information people need to manage these programs simply isn't available?
It makes it harder to make decisions. Congress, for example, has been flying in the dark for years on certain issues that are really important to the public. I mentioned that tax data that just came out. That data was just for 2023. When they were debating the Big Beautiful Bill last year, they didn't have data beyond 2022 to evaluate what actually had happened from the previous tax legislation. And they're not going to have data about this bill for another 3 years. And so whenever this data is missing, it just leads to people not being able to really fully evaluate the impact of programs and have to make decisions without the full knowledge that they really deserve to do so.
Are you concerned that there's an ostrich effect going on here, that people just don't want to know the data, so they put their head in the sand and then they can make whatever decisions they want?
It's possible. But I will say, when we've been talking for years with a bipartisan group of members of Congress and senators and folks across both administrations, and we found the need for good data from government to be a really, truly bipartisan, nonpartisan issue that people want. We have found almost no resistance to the idea that we need data. And while I'm sure there are certain political moments where that has happened, it just hasn't been the broad feeling we've got from all these conversations.
If there is bipartisan support for broader data collection, how would you expect to see Congress move to facilitate that?
Well, we would hope that Congress would start thinking forward and say, not just what data do I need today that I wish I had, but what data will I need in 5 years, and how could we make this better? We would hope that any piece of legislation that has an impact on data, for example, the Big Beautiful Bill that created some big changes in the tax code, should be accompanied by funding to make the data about that better so they can understand it the next time around. It's not something we currently see, but something we really are passionate about.
Do you think it would make sense in legislation when Congress is establishing a program or reauthorizing a program that they would also set aside funding for the data collection?
Personally, I believe that should be mandatory. It would be valuable to them and valuable to the public, and really create a level of accountability and transparency to policies that I think we've actually never seen. And I absolutely would support that.
Does Congress have the capacity to actually ingest and make sense of the data?
They could. I think if the right changes were made, they absolutely could. In its current state, it's really, really hard. They don't have many more tools than the American public does to do so, and also don't have a lot of time on their hands. And so I think they could if they brought it into existence, but currently, no, I don't think they do.
If you step back for a minute, what would it mean for federal data capability to be treated as core infrastructure, something that's managed for continuity and reliability, rather than as little individual pots of information?
Well, I mean, one very clear outcome of that would be my job wouldn't need to exist anymore. but again, much more broadly, I think it's the way we hope the future is. We believe it is very much like infrastructure, very much like your plumbing. You don't choose to pay for your plumbing one year or another. It's just you expect it to work, and when it breaks, you pay to fix it. And it would create a world where people have access to and understand what's going on in the country at all times. It's standard. It's not debated every year, and it would lead to, we believe, a higher level of trust and understanding in government.
What would it take to make that happen?
It would take a concerted effort. I think our federal data system is phenomenal, as you mentioned in the beginning, but also it's kind of come together in an unintentional way. It was never meant to be a system. It's a bunch of discrete things that are good in some cases and bad in others. And so it would take some intentionality in saying we want to bring federal data into the 21st century and make it as good as the data that any public company has to run its business.
There's been some discussion of collecting up all of the statistical agencies into a single organization so that there's better infrastructure there and support. Would that be a step in the right direction or not helpful?
I don't know. We'd have to really do some good thinking about it. I think that's what's missing. I wouldn't want to say that that's the solution, but having that discussion is the right thing to do for sure.
I've been speaking with Richard Coffin. He's Chief of Research and Advocacy at USAFacts. Richard, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Terry.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.